There is a recording in our archives that should not exist. Listen to it for a moment before I tell you anything else. A voice, flat, unhurried, almost bored, speaking into a maintenance log while the sensors behind it scream. The voice is checking a coolant valve. It is complaining quietly about the temperature. And somewhere in the dark beyond that little pressurized room, something the size of a continent is folding itself open like a hand, turning toward the source of the sound, and beginning with terrible patience to move. The voice does not stop. It finishes logging the coolant valve. It notes the time. And then it says a sentence so small, so ordinary, that the first scholars who heard it assumed the file was corrupted. Day's about done. Still here. Coffee's gone, so that's the real tragedy. We filed that voice for 400 cycles under a single word. We called it a myth. I want you to sit with how badly we were wrong, because I am one of the people who has to. I'm a Cassinal archivist of the 11th lattice, and I need you to understand what that means before any of the rest of this will land the way it should. My people do not believe in things the way yours do. We do not have faith or rumor or the comfortable middle ground of probably. For a Cassinal, a thing is real when it is filed and cross-witnessed by independent recorders, and a thing is not real, not exaggerated, not unverified, but genuinely non-existent when it is not. This is not a quirk of our temperament. It is the foundation of our civilization, the bedrock under 10 million cycles of law and memory. We built a culture that never lies to itself, and the price of that achievement, which I am only now learning to name, is that we cannot believe a truth until it agrees to be catalogued. So when the stories began, and they began long before my hatching, about a human who had ruled the Black Reach, who had reigned over the dead moon in the thrashing belt and held a war zone in a closed fist, we did the only thing our nature permitted. We refused them. There were no records. There were no cross-witnesses. There was no body, no throne, no fleet, no decree carved in any registry we trusted. There was only a name that drifted from species to species like ash on a current, growing heavier each time it was spoken, and our archives stamped that name with the worst classification we possess. Folklore, which is to say, did not happen. How does a civilization that has never once believed a lie end up being the last to believe the truth? That is the question I have been assigned to answer. I did not want it. I have it anyway. To understand why the sovereign of the Black Reach could not be allowed to be real, you have to understand what the legend had become by the time it reached me. 400 cycles is a long time for a story to grow, and stories, unlike Cassinal, are not constrained by evidence. They are constrained only by what their listeners need to be true. By my hatching, the sovereign was a tyrant of impossible scale. The tellings agreed on the broad shape even where they disagreed on everything else. There had been a being, the species shifted depending on who you asked, who had seized the thrashing belt during the long catastrophe we now call the Vasan collapse, and who had ruled it. Not defended, not occupied, ruled. The sovereign was said to have commanded a fleet that turned the debris field itself into a weapon, to have held the tide-locked moon as a throne world, to have bent thousands to a single will through a terror so absolute that no enemy who entered the Reach ever transmitted again. The Black Reach, in the telling, went silent because the sovereign made it silent. I want to be honest about how that story felt to us, because the feeling is part of the crime. It felt correct. It fit everything we already believed about power. We are a people who file, and a being who could erase an entire region from the record, who could rule a place so completely that nothing escaped it to be witnessed. That was a being our instincts recognized as monstrous and plausible at once. A despot leaves a hole in the archive shaped exactly like a despot. The silence of the Black Reach was, to us, the fingerprint of a king. And so the doubt that should have saved us was the very thing we used to dismiss her. No throne was ever found. No body. No fleet wreck consistent with the legend. No decree. No court. No chain of command. A tyrant of that magnitude should have left ruins you could read like a ledger, and the thrashing belt held nothing of the kind. Only the ordinary debris of an evacuation gone wrong, and one small, dead relay spur half buried in the regolith of a moon no one had any reason to remember. Do you see the trap we built for ourselves? The absence of a tyrant's wreckage did not make us doubt the tyrant. It made us doubt the story. We concluded, with the cold confidence of a people who file, that since no sovereign's empire was present, no sovereign had existed. We were so close to the truth that we used it to walk in the wrong direction. The empire was missing because there had never been an empire. There had only ever been a door, and someone standing in it. The trigger, and in my experience there is always a trigger, some accident that drags the buried thing into the light against everyone's preference, came in the form of a salvage claim. A mineral consortium, working the outer thrashing belt for the heavy elements that collect in old battlefields, snagged something their instruments could not classify. Not a ship, not ore. A pressurized object, intact, its hull signature centuries out of date, its interior still holding a thread of stored power so faint it registered as a rounding error. It was Kestrel 9, the relay spur from the dead moon, and inside it, sealed in a memory core built to outlast its builders, was the recording. I was in the tribunal hall the first time it played. I want to describe that room to you because of what it became. Picture the most rigorous court your species can imagine, not a place of argument, but a place of verification, where 40 Cassinal recorders of the highest lattice sat in a closed lattice array, every one of them prepared to cross-witness whatever the core contained and stamp it into permanent reality. We did not expect to be moved. We expected to be precise. We had come to file a myth out of existence. Finally, with hard data, the way you might finally throw out a possession you'd kept too long. The first thing the recording gave us was a sound none of us could parse. A human, alone, exhaling slowly through her teeth. And then her voice, addressed to no one, addressed to the log, addressed, I understand now, to the future, in case the future ever bothered to listen. Relay Tech Sunquist, Kestrel 9, day 1 of however many this turns into. Beacons holding, corridors open. I'd kill for a window that faced literally anything but this moon. 40 of the most disciplined recorders in the 11th lattice sat in silence. We had come to bury a sovereign. We had found a woman complaining about the view. Let me tell you what we were actually looking at, because it took us far longer to understand than it should have, and the delay itself is the most damning thing in this entire account. The threat in the Black Reach was real. That much, at least, the legend had not invented. But it was not a tyrant, and it was not the sovereign. It was the thing we now call the sweep, and the sweep is the reason I have learned to be afraid of efficiency. The sweep was not a conqueror. It had no ambitions you could negotiate with, no throne it wanted, no terror it enjoyed. It was a process, a clade fleet that moved through inhabited space on a schedule, and its method never varied. It would enter a system, and it would catalog it. Every body, every signal, every living thing, mapped and indexed with a thoroughness that I am ashamed to say my own people found beautiful when we first studied the recovered patterns. And then, having cataloged the system completely, it would delete it, region by region. On time, the sweep did not hate, the sweep finished. I have come to believe this is why the galaxy could imagine a sovereign but not a relay technician. We understand power that wants. A despot, a tyrant, a king of ash, those are forces with appetites, and appetites we can map. But the sweep wanted nothing. It simply proceeded. And against a thing that simply proceeds, what does heroism even look like? Where is the duel, the throne stormed, the tyrant thrown down? There is none. There is only the question of how long you can keep a door open against something that has all the time there is, and feels nothing at all. And here the great misdirection of 400 cycles finally collapsed in that tribunal hall, and I watched 40 recorders fail all at once to hold their composure. There was no empire because there was no empire. There was no fleet, no court, no chain of command, no throne because the sovereign of the Black Reach, the despot who ruled the thrashing belt, who held a war zone in a closed fist, whose terror silenced every enemy who entered the Reach, was one human woman, with a maintenance kit and a reroute manual, standing in a relay spur the size of a storage closet, holding a single beacon open while a continent of patient death came to delete her. Her name was Margaret Sundqvist. The humans she worked with called her Greta. She held no rank that mattered. She had not been chosen or trained or prepared. She had simply been the technician who happened to be at Kestrel 9 when the sweep entered the Vasan system and the evacuation began to fail. That is the reign. That is the whole of it. One woman off the record holding a door. What she actually did, once we understood it, was so simple in its conception and so impossible in its execution that our engineering lattices have spent 2 cycles trying to model it and have not succeeded. When the sweep entered Vasan, the inhabited worlds began to evacuate, a vast, ragged refugee column threading outward through the only navigable lane in the thrashing belt, a corridor barely wide enough to fly, choked with debris, lethal to anyone who lost their bearings. And the thing that kept that corridor flyable, the single point of light that let 100,000 fleeing souls find the lane in the dark and stay in it, was a navigation beacon. A beacon broadcast from a relay spur on a dead moon. From Kestrel 9. The beacon was failing. The relay was old, its power core decaying, its systems never built for sustained combat load broadcast. And the moment the beacon went dark, the corridor would become invisible and the column would scatter into the belt and die there, ship by ship, against the rocks. Greta Sundqvist's job had been to maintain that relay. When the evacuation began and the relay began to fail, and the order came to abandon Kestrel 9 and fall back to the column, she did the maintenance instead. She rerouted power from every non-essential system into the beacon. She bypassed the safeties. She fed the relay's own structural reserves into the broadcast, burning the spur alive from the inside to keep one light on in the dark. And then, because the reroute required constant manual adjustment as the core decayed, because there was no way to set it and leave, she stayed to adjust it. That is the reign of the sovereign of the Black Reach. A woman, alone, hand on a valve, keeping a door open by refusing to leave the room. And here is where I have to tell you about the logs, because the logs are the part that breaks me, and I am told they break everyone. Kept logging. Every shift end against every reason she recorded a status entry the way she had every day of an ordinary career maintaining an unremarkable relay on a moon no one cared about. And the entries are I do not have your word for it. They are casual. Day 4, still here, beacons holding. Found a card game in the old crew files, it's terrible, I love it. Day 9, reroutes getting touchy, talked it back into behaving. Out of real coffee for good now, down to the powdered stuff. New low. Day 14, still here. If anyone ever finds this, the coffee situation was a war crime. I have to confess something about my own people now, and it does us no credit. When we first transcribed these logs, our scholars could not accept that they meant what they said. A being in that situation, performing that act, would not speak like this, not in any framework we possessed. So we did what Cassinal do. We assumed the logs were code. We assumed the casualness was a cipher, that coffee was a coordinate, that the card game was a tactical schema, that this woman was a military intelligence of the highest order encrypting strategic doctrine inside a screen of mundane chatter. We produced 400 pages of annotation on the strategic significance of the powdered coffee. We ran her shift logs through every decryption lattice we own. And every time we asked our classification engine to assign her a rank, to tell us what she was, where she fit, what tier of command could produce such a being, the engine returned the same result. Not unknown, not insufficient data. It returned a stamp I had never seen the engine produce before, and have never seen it produce since. Unclassifiable. We thought it was an error. We thought we had failed to feed it enough. It took me an embarrassing length of time to understand that the engine was not failing. It was being honest. There was no rank code for a relay technician who decided, alone, to be the thing the whole galaxy would later need a sovereign to explain. The casualness was not a code. The casualness was the truth. She talked about coffee because she was a person. And she kept logging because that was simply what you did. And the most strategically significant thing in those 400 annotated pages is that there was nothing strategic in them at all. Just a human, keeping herself company, keeping the light on. The legend says the rain lasted an age. The recording says it lasted 19 days. I want you to feel the size of that gap, because the gap is where the myth lived. 400 cycles of telling stretched 19 days into an eternity, because an eternity was easier to believe than the truth. It is easier to imagine that a power vast enough to rule for an age held the Black Reach than to imagine that 19 days of one tired woman's stubbornness held it instead. The myth was not a lie told to honor her. The myth was a lie told to avoid her. We made her a sovereign so we would not have to look at her as a person, because a person we might have had to save. And that is the silence I have learned to hear inside the recording, the thing the legend never explained, the thing I had to assemble from the navigation records and the evacuation manifests. No one came back for her. They could not. You have to understand the cold arithmetic of that corridor. The column could not turn. To send a ship back up the lane against the flow would have collapsed the corridor she was dying to keep open. The only way to honor what she was doing was to leave her doing it. Every soul she saved was saved by not saving her. She kept the door open, and the price of the door was that no one could ever walk back through it to reach her, and she knew that, and she stayed in the room. We Casanal pride ourselves on game theory. We model sacrifice in our lattices. We compute the cold optima. We know the mathematics of the held line. And I sat in that tribunal hall and watched my people, who have never wept in any way your species would recognize, confront the one variable our models had never been able to hold. That the optimal move and the unbearable move can be the same move, and that a person can choose it and keep logging about the coffee while they do. I told you the recording contained a final misdirection, and it is the one I find hardest to speak about, because it is the one where she could have lived. There was a slot, day 16. A late straggler ship, a damaged hauler limping up the corridor toward the lane, came within range of Kestrel 9, and its captain, I have her name too, a human named Oluwaseun Bright, and I include it because every name in this account was once stamped folklore and every one of them was real. Captain Bright hailed the relay and offered Greta the slot. The hauler had room. The corridor was holding. There was time, just barely, to pull her off the moon and run for the lane together. The recording captured the whole exchange. I have heard it more times than is good for me. Greta's voice, still flat, still impossibly calm. Negative on that, Captain. Beacon needs hands on it. She drops, your corridor drops, and there's a column behind you. You take the slot. That slot's for you, Captain Bright says, and you can hear in a human voice the exact sound of someone refusing to understand what they are being told. I know, Greta says, take a kid instead, you've got one aboard. A pause. 3. Then it was never my slot, was it? And then, after a silence that our recorders measured to the fraction, tell them, and here she stops, and you can hear her decide not to make it grand, decide against the speech, decide to be exactly the size she was. Tell them the coffee was terrible and I stayed anyway. They'll get it when they're older. She gave away the only exit she would ever be offered, and she made a joke, and she went back to the valve. This is the moment my people cannot compute, and I have stopped trying to make them. I have stopped trying to make myself. There is no rank code for it. There is no lattice that holds it. She had a way out, and she gave it to a child whose name she never learned, and she returned to a dying room to keep a light on for strangers, and the engine was right all along. Unclassifiable. Some truths refuse the file. That does not make them less real. It is, I have come to believe, the surest sign that they are. The sweep reached Kestrel 9 on the 19th day. The recording holds it all. The sensors that had been screaming for 19 days finally fell silent, not because the threat had passed, but because it had arrived, because there is nothing left to warn of when the thing is already at the door. And Greta Sundqvist, relay technician, did the last thing the archive records her doing. She logged her status. Day 19, still here. Beacons holding, corridors clear, columns through, manifest says all of them, every ship, so, a breath. So that's the job done then. And then the smallest pause and the most human sentence in our entire archive, spoken not to us, not to the future, but to herself, the way you speak when you have decided something and only need to hear it once. Okay. Okay, Greta. The beacon held for another 4 minutes. The corridor stayed lit until the last confirmed ship cleared the lane. And then the broadcast stopped, and the recording stopped, and there is nothing after that but the steady, patient hum of the memory core doing the one thing it was built to do, which was to outlast everything, and to wait. She did not survive. I want to be clear about that, because the legend, in its kindness and its cowardice, sometimes let her survive, slipped her away on a hidden ship, gave the sovereign a secret abdication, a quiet retirement on some far world. The truth is that she died on a dead moon, keeping a light on for people she would never meet, and no one came back, and no one could. But here is the thing the sweep could not delete, the thing that makes this a victory and not only a grief. It deleted the moon. It deleted the relay's broadcast, the corridor, the system, everything it touched. What it did not do, what it had no reason to do, no protocol for, no appetite to bother with, was destroy a powered-down memory core and a half-dead spur it had already silenced. Why would it? The sweep finishes what speaks. The core said nothing. It simply held her, and waited 400 cycles in the dark of the thrashing belt, and let itself be found. The win was never survival. She knew that on day one. The win was that the recording lived. The win was that 19 days got proven, that a name got cross-witnessed at last, that the lie which had comforted a galaxy for 4 centuries, the lie that no one had held the line, that the Black Reach went silent on its own, that there had only ever been a sovereign or a story, that life finally died in a tribunal hall in front of 40 recorders who had come to bury it and stayed to stamp it real. So I have to ask the question my assignment was meant to answer, and I have to answer it honestly, which is the only way my people know how. Why did we make her a sovereign? Why did the galaxy take a relay technician and build her a throne she never sat on, a fleet she never commanded, an age of terror in place of 19 days of stubborn grace? I think it is because the truth implicated us, and the myth let us off. A sovereign is something that happens to you. A sovereign is a force, a weather, a fact of the universe you can mourn without owing it anything. But a relay technician who chose, who was offered the exit and gave it to a child, who could have been saved if the arithmetic had been kinder, who died because the rest of the column kept flying and never turned back. A person like that asks something of everyone who hears about her. She asks what you would have done in the room. And it is so much easier, so much more comfortable to inflate her past the point where the question can reach you. We did not build her a throne to honor her. We built it to hide behind. And my own people, I will say this last part plainly because we owe it. We did worse than mythologize her. We erased her with the one tool we trusted most. We refused to file what we could not cross-witness, and so for 400 cycles a real woman who really did this thing was, by the law of our own nature, non-existent. We were so proud that we never lied to ourselves. We never noticed that a civilization which only believes what it can file will always, always arrive at the truth too late, and that there is a species in this galaxy that solves the problem the other way. That keeps the record by being it. That logs the coffee and holds the door and lets the memory core wait in the dark, on the chance that someone, someday, will finally be willing to hear. I have changed the classification. It took an act of the full lattice and it will be argued about for cycles, but the stamp on the file no longer reads folklore, and it no longer reads unclassifiable either. I wrote the new entry myself. It is not grand. She would not have wanted grand. It reads, Sundqvist Margaret, relay technician, Vossen thrashing belt, Kestrel 9, held the corridor 19 days, saved the column, stayed anyway. And then, because the archive is real now in a way it has never been before, because I have learned at last what a record is for, one line more in her own words, cross-witnessed and permanent and true. The coffee was terrible. She stayed anyway. That is the reign of the Black Reach. That is the whole of it. Not a throne, a door and a person who would not leave the room, and a galaxy that needed 400 cycles and one recording that should not exist to finally be brave enough to know her name.